linguistically recognized states of satisfaction and deprivation in human languages, and they manifest in cross-cultural artistic themes. So Corbin Scott Cornell, in his study Bright Shadow of Reality, Spiritual Longing in C.S. Lewis, wrote that Sehnsucht might be said to represent just as much a basic theme of literature as love is a basic theme of literature. Consider this passage from a book that Lewis himself loved, The Wind in the Willows by Graham Greene. Said, a bird piped up suddenly and was still, and a light breeze sprang up and set the reeds and bulrushes rustling. The rat, who was in the stern of the boat while Mole sculled, sat up suddenly and listened with a passionate interest. Intentness. Mole, who with gentle strokes was just keeping the boat moving while he scanned the banks with care, looked at him with curiosity. "Oh, it's gone," sighed the rat, sinking back into his seat again. "So beautiful and strange and new. Since it was to end so soon, I almost wish I'd never heard it. For it's roused a longing in me that is pain. Nothing seems worthwhile but just to hear that sound once more and go on listening to it forever." You'd have to read the book to find out what the sound was. Lewis says, joy isn't a desire for the worldly objects that occasion it or trigger it, in as much as those objects that seem to trigger this desire experience in us don't satisfy the longing that they occasion. He says, thus we remain conscious of a desire which no natural happiness will satisfy. But actually, the argument from desire can appeal to a range of what we might call existentially relevant innate desires. Lewis, for example, counted what he called the irrepressible thirst for immortality as being among the contents of natural desire. And we find witness to this in a range of thinkers from different worldview perspectives. So Christopher Hitchens, atheist, commenting on his favourite song, Stevie Winwood's Higher Love, said, "I admit it has evangelical overtones, but I do long for a higher love." Or the agnostic philosopher Anthony O'Hare speaks of the perfection we long for in some other world. Roger Scruton wrote of the way that beauty points us beyond this world to a kingdom of ends in which our immortal longings are finally answered. Atheist Bruce Scheiman says, "I want to believe that our timeless quest for goodness and transcendence has its omega point in God. Even though I cannot believe in God, I still feel the need for God." Sociologist Charles Taylor, it's our aspiration to separate ourselves from evil and chaos. That's in his book, A Secular Age. He's a Canadian philosopher as well. Taylor describes this powerful intuition that in some activity or condition there lies a fullness, a richness, he says, a state wherein life is more worthwhile, more admirable, more what it should be. Perhaps this sense of fullness is something we just catch glimpses of from afar off, something there will be moments of experienced fullness, of joy and fulfillment, where we feel ourselves there. And he says such mystical experiences can help define a direction to our lives, but the sense of orientation also has its negative slope, where we experience above all a distance, an absence, an exile, the nostalgia for something transcendent. And Taylor returns to this spiritual longing towards the end of his magisterial book, A Secular Age, noting the need for meaning, a desire for eternity, and concluding that while culturally speaking, He says there are strong incentives to remain within the bounds of the human domain. He says, yet the sense that there is something more presses in upon us. Well, Lewis made very effective use of this sort of experiential point of in various presentations of the argument from desire, most of which in his writings take that joy experience as their starting point. Lewis wasn't the first to explore the argument from desire. Aquinas does it in Summa contra Gentiles, Pascal in his Pensées, Thomas Chalmers in On Natural Theology, Book 2, or G.K. Chesterton in The Everlasting Man, indeed, which is a book we know that Lewis may have been influenced by. Lewis wasn't the only scholar of his day to use it. Contemporaries like Jacques Maritain in Approaches to God or C.E.M. Joad also discussed it. But it's true to say that it's due to Lewis's influence, his articulation of this theme, that an increasing number of contemporary scholars have become interested in arguments from desire. Philosophers like Todd Burris and Michael Cantrell, John Haldane, Robert Hoyler, Peter Kreeft, Robert Sloan Lee, Alistair McGrath, Clifford Williams, and so on. I put a selection of books here on screen that contain sections dealing with this argument. Indeed, the C.S. Lewis's Christian Apologetics pro and con book is a book in which I have a debate on this argument with the editor Gregory Basham. Alistair McGrath, the British theologian, says that this argument is not really an argument for the existence of God in the strictest sense of the term. We'd need to expand Lewis's point to include the declaration that God either is or is an essential condition for the satisfaction of the natural human desire for transcendent fulfillment. But actually, I think I'd say that some formulations of the AFD invoke God more directly than others. Let's put it like that. Well, as I say, Lewis presents this argument in a wide variety of sort of argumentative modes, and there are cogent arguments from desire that we can sort of put in different ways and that jointly constitute a cumulative argument from desire. Let's start off with a, on the face of it, prima facie argument from desire. Samuel Alexander's Clifford lectures on space, time, and deity introduced Lewis to the distinction between enjoyment and contemplation, a distinction Lewis himself would later parse as the difference between looking at and looking along a beam of light. This experience of enjoying joy is an inherently teleological, end-pointing sort of experience. Points beyond itself to a transcendent and innately desirable something more. Contemplating joy leads further away from naturalism, pantheistic worldview, and towards theism. As Douglas Grutas concludes, that the argument from yearning renders credible some transcendent source of human satisfaction beyond the material world. It points to a theistic worldview, since it's based on the claim that humans desire a transcendent reality that can satisfy the human person, and nothing less than something personal would seem to be able to do that. To take the phenomenology, the lived experience of this desire for something transcendent more out there at face value, on the face of it, is to look along that experience towards the transcendent other. As soon as you've grasped the simple distinction, says Lewis, between looking at and looking along, it raises the question. You get one experience of a thing when you look along it, another when you look at it. Which is the true or valid experience? He observes it's come to be taken for granted that the external account of a thing somehow refutes or debunks the account from the inside. All these moral ideas which look so transcendental and beautiful from inside, says the wisecracker, are really one mass of biological instinct and inherited taboos. And one plays the game of the other way round by replying, if you only step inside, the things that look to you like instincts and taboos will suddenly reveal their real and transcendental nature. Well, actually, Lewis was ahead of the curve here. Contemporary philosophy of knowledge, epistemology, is open to playing the game the other way round. Various epistemologies of trust, like reform epistemology, illustrate this point. Or Richard Swinburne, who talks about the principle of rationality called the principle of credulity, the principle of when to trust, that we ought to believe that things are as they seem to be unless and until we have evidence that we're mistaken. Trying to say the contrary would lead you to hardly believing anything. If you can't trust appearances as such, you can't trust any new experiences you might appeal to justify believing anything on the basis of any argument at all. Swinburne explains that this principle of credulity just describes how we're inclined to believe that things are, and it has a wide application beyond those gathered by your ordinary, physical senses, like your sense of sight, he says. For example, it applies to relying on your own memory, what you seem to recall. Memory isn't a sensory or perceptual faculty. It's a very general epistemic principle which we could apply, I think, to the experience of the desire for something transcendent, which seems to us to point beyond the world. Alvin Plantinga argues for the properly basic status of belief in God evoked by desire. He says, perhaps this restlessness without God leads to belief in God. Perhaps God's designed us in this way to impel us to try to get us in touch with him. The process leading to the formation of the beliefs in the truth, the relevant module of the design plan, how we think, has its purpose, the production of true belief, even if it goes by way of perception of beauty or wish fulfillment, indeed. In the book, 24 or so Arguments for God, Todd Burris and Michael Cantrell, who I mentioned earlier, argue that God is a precondition of humans obtaining complete happiness, and that complete happiness is a seemingly non-defective desire. That a seemingly non-defective desire is, on the face of it, an indication of the possibility of the object of that desire being real, from which it would follow that God's existence is, on the face of it, possible, at least, which, when you tie that in with the key, as a support for the key premise of the modal ontological argument that Alvin Plantinga puts, would be one support for that argument, interestingly. Aristotelian, going back to Aristotle, arguments from desire. Lewis said this in Pilgrim's Regress in the preface. If a man diligently followed this desire, pursuing the false objects until their falsity appeared, and then resolutely abandoning them, he must come at last to the clear knowledge that the human soul was made to enjoy some object that's never fully given in our present mode of subjective and spatio-temporal experience. This desire, with a capital D, was in the soul as the siege perilous in Arthur's castle, the chair in which only one could sit. And if nature makes nothing in vain, the one who can sit in this chair must exist. And that nature makes nothing in vain is a quotation back to Aristotle. Aristotle's principle that nature makes nothing in vain. So you could formalize the argument here like this. 1, nature makes no type of thing in vain. 2, humans have a natural type of desire, joy, that would be in vain unless some object that's never fully given in our present mode of existence is obtainable by human in some future mode of existence, from which it would follow deductively that therefore the object of joy must be obtainable in some future mode of human existence. Well, of course, Aristotle's principle is quite controversial these days, but one could give a deductive argument based on a restricted application of that kind of Aristotelian principle, You could argue one, nature makes no type of innate human desire in vain, and mount the same kind of argument that humans have an innate types of desire that would be in vain if God didn't exist. For example, desires for objective value and purpose, desires for forgiveness, cosmic justice, and so on. Again, from which it would follow that God exists. Or indeed, treating that kind of Aristotelian principle simply as what's called a heuristic principle, a principle of reasoning, a kind of rule of thumb for thinking about the world. If we argued that one, humans have innate desires that would be in vain if God doesn't exist, and two, that we should assume that no type of natural thing exists in vain until and unless we're shown otherwise, a bit like Swinburne's principle, phrasing the principle of credulity, it would follow that therefore, until and unless we're shown that the relevant innate desires exist in vain, we should assume that God exists. So this would shift a burden of proof onto the atheist here. Another way of phrasing this kind of would be what's called an abductive argument, sort of argument to the best explanation. Victor Reppert, author of a very good book on C.S. Lewis's Dangerous Idea, which is about Lewis's argument from reason. But in his online blog, Victor Reppert talks about Lewis's argument from desire, and he phrases it in terms of Bayesian probability theory, and leaving out the complicated stuff, here's how the argument would go. He says, on Christian theism, God's intention of creating humans is to fit them for eternity in God's presence. As such, it stands to reason that we should find ourselves dissatisfied with worldly satisfactions because we're made for more than that, basically. So Reppert says, let's put the likelihood that we should long for the infinite, given theism, at 0.9, so quite high. He says, I wouldn't say that such desires couldn't possibly arise in an atheistic worldview, but how likely would they arise in such a world, in an atheistic world? So long as the answer to that question is less likely than in a theistic world, then the presence of these desires confirm theism. At this point, the main kind of objection is going to be from the field of what's called evolutionary psychology, and indeed naturalistic evolutionary psychology. For example, the philosopher Eric Weilenberg suggests that the kind of nebulous nature of joy might be an advantage, might be advantageous if joy arose, if we happen to have some sort of mutation in our evolutionary history that causes us to experience that might be advantageous. He says joy's lack of clear intentional object might have led early humans down what he called Lewisian false paths, such as the pursuit of sex, and power, and adventure, that did have direct fitness advantages. So, this desire for satisfaction, and I don't know, what's it for, I don't really know what I'm looking for, leads you to pursue all sorts of things that do have fitness advantages. But this account lacks explanatory power because Weilenberg only suggests that restlessness might be advantageous. He says early humans favored with a chronic, ill-defined restlessness of heart might have outcompeted other humans who were naturally more sedentary and complacent. Well, okay, might, but equally it might be the case that hominids affected with a chronic, ill-defined restlessness of heart would be outcompeted by humans free from such existential ennui. So I don't find that particularly powerful as an explanation. Weilenberg's hypothesis also lacks explanatory simplicity compared to the hypothesis that the direct fitness advantages of sex, power, and adventure are self-sufficient. Indeed, when our ancestors realized that neither sex nor power nor adventure, etc., satisfy this joy desire, wouldn't that lessen the significance of those advantageous activities in their minds, thereby constituting an evolutionary disadvantage compared to creatures lacking the joy desire? And of course, Weilenberg offers no explanation for the appearance of joy in our gene pool, as it were, only for its natural selection should it appear. Indeed, Gregory Basham, in my debate with him, concedes these possible explanations are highly conjectural. As Victor Reppert says, natural desires that are unfulfillable on Earth is precisely what you should expect from the point of view of theism. I seriously doubt that we can do this from the point of view of naturalism, even if a halfway decent-looking evolutionary explanation of how such desires could arise were forthcoming from the naturalist. And of course, that naturalistic evolutionary psychology objection presupposes the soundness of naturalistic evolutionary psychology. But Stephen M. Downes, for example, says that there's a broad consensus among philosophers of science that evolutionary psychology per se is a deeply flawed enterprise, and an increasing number of books arguing this point have been published. Naturalistic evolutionary psychology, of course, presupposes the neo-Darwinian account of human evolution by random variation and natural selection, an account that Lewis doubted and which is the subject of much current debate. Fourth way of the argument would be what we can call an inductive argument, inductive arguments from desire. Lewis in Mere Christianity puts the argument this way: creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for those desires exist. A baby feels hunger, well, there is such a thing as food. A duckling wants to swim, well, there is such a thing as water. He says, if I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. And it's that most probable explanation suggests an inference here from the sort of examples that he gives before mentioning the joy desire. So we could put the argument like this. One, humans have an innate existential desire for the transcendent, stroke God, stroke one or more states of being for which God is plausibly a necessary precondition. Two, most innate, so human desires, these existential desires, are such that there exists some object capable of satisfying them. Therefore, the transcendent stroke God probably exists, and it's you have to put that probably in there because we're making an inductive argument here. Even if we set aside the distinction that's often used in this argument between innate and non-innate desires, even if we set that aside, actually it seems to me that to be a sound, again, heuristic principle, a sensible way of thinking about things, to give every desire the presumption of having a fulfillment until conceptual analysis or evidence shows otherwise. So again, I think the burden of proof should be on the skeptic here. A final way of putting this argument is into what's called, philosophers called a reductio ad absurdum, where you assume the falsity of a principle and show that that leads to absurd consequences in order to argue for the truth of the principle. So again, in Mere Christianity, Lewis says this. He says, if I find in myself a desire which no experience in the world can satisfy, the most plausible explanation is that I was made for another world. And he adds, if none of my earthly pleasures satisfy it, that does not prove that the universe is a fraud. So he's setting up here the idea that if we were to think that the desire that he's talking about has no satisfaction, then we'd also have to think that the universe we're living in is in some sense a fraud, has perpetrated a sort of joke upon humanity, a cosmic joke at our expense. He says a man may love a woman and not win her, but it would be very odd if the phenomenon called falling in love occurred in a sexless world. By analogy, just because we desire the transcendent, or desire forgiveness, or desire cosmic justice, etc., perhaps doesn't guarantee that we would personally, individually get those things, but those desires would be very odd desires to occur in a world where no satisfaction for them possibly existed. Lewis contended that naturalism inevitably generates what he called a disharmony between our hearts and nature. As Geoffrey Gordon concludes, if the universe lacks purpose, if there's no given inherent purpose to the universe, a purpose that we discover rather than inventing for ourselves, that kind of discoverable purpose of life. If the universe lacks purpose, it says man is a creature imbued with passions remarkably inappropriate to the universe in which he is immersed. In Mere Christianity, Lewis observed that we desire other people to conform to objective moral law and desire ourselves to be innocent before that law, before arguing that this law is rooted in God and making a moral argument for theism. But the desire to fulfill moral duty is absurd on a naturalistic worldview, but fits comfortably within theism. See, for example, George Mavrode's famous 1986 paper on religion and the queerness of morality. Indeed, everything, including purpose, is objectively speaking meaningless without the existence of objective value. And so tying the argument from desire with the argument from meta-ethics, the moral argument, in the final analysis, it shows we must choose between theism as a worldview and not only naturalism, but nihilism as a worldview. So an existential reductive argument from desire might go something like this. One, given an instantiated kind, K, so human beings, possessing innate existential desires, the existence of K would be absurd to the extent that it's impossible for any member of K to have those desires satisfied. Well, two, humans are an instantiated kind, okay, with innate existential desires that are impossible, or we could say very unlikely, or pretty unlikely to be satisfied unless God exists. Three, therefore, it follows, therefore, that unless God exists, human existence is absurd, or is probably absurd, at least to a substantial extent. Well, yeah, premise 4, that however human existence is not absurd, at least not to any substantial extent, it would follow 5 that therefore God, at least probably, exists. Now, the key premise here, I think, is 4, and I would simply argue that 4 is properly basic. Again, it's one of those things to be believed or assumed in the absence of sufficient reason not to believe or assume it. If the satisfaction of our innate existential desires requires God, then the properly basic belief that life isn't absurd places the burden of proof on the nihilist. Now, of course, some may profess a willingness to pay the price tag of affirming nihilism, but this affirmation is not an easy one to make or to consistently sustain if you take it seriously. So to pull some of these threads together for us, before C.S. Lewis, many people wrote about joy and transcendent desires, and several thinkers gestured towards or made arguments from desire, folks like Aquinas, Pascal, Chalmers, Chesterton, Joad. But Lewis, first of all, considered a plurality of innate desires, although he focused on joy, but he did widen the innate desires that one looked at. And B, he used a plurality of argumentative forms, putting the argument in different ways in different rhetorical contexts. So he didn't just give forward a argument from desire, but various arguments from desire in that sense. And Lewis produced the 20th century's principal sustained positive engagement with the argument from desire, which has inspired thinkers ever since. He's become the classical locus of thinking about this argument. These factors secure Lewis's place as a central figure in the theistic argument from desire, one who's inspired this growing high-level engagement with the argument in contemporary philosophy and apologetics.